Now, you can write a book about how we've got into this state. In fact, I have written a book about it. But there's one point picking up on what Pat said that I think is very worth emphasising. Pat is talking about denial of responsibility. This sort of kill us, we deserve it, it's all our fault. I want to point out this is a very flattering notion. Very flattering to us, to Americans, to Europeans, to Brits, as if the whole world is somehow under our control. If bad things happen, it's because we've got bad leaders and we can get rid of them and get nice leaders and everything will be fine. One argument for humanitarian interventionism is it's not quite as pure humanitarian intervention as some of its supporters might think. The question comes up, what happens when you don't intervene? When Europe didn't intervene in Bosnia, what happened? We had refugees spewing across the continent, vast numbers, building up far-right parties everywhere as a racist reaction. We had international crime getting loose in the Balkans. One of the reasons behind the build-up of Al-Qaeda and radical Islam was that they could point with some justice to the major government, to Mitterrand in Paris, and say, look at these Christians, look at these Jews. They are allowing the slaughter of European Muslims. And when people talk about the costs of intervention, often with good reason and often with great worry, we should worry too about the costs of not intervening, the sins of omission as well as the sins of commission.
Okay.
Karen, could I just say I think that's a really important point, and I think that the Bosnian example is very instructive. The costs of intervention can be seen quite clearly after it's happened, but people often forget the counterfactual. What happens if you don't intervene? That too can be an exercise with cost.
Why are Muslim states so loath to act to protect fellow Muslims in Darfur?
Well, you're really talking about the Muslim Arab states in the Arab League. I suppose the main reason is, with the sort of partial exception of Kuwait, a little bit partial, very partial exception of Jordan, they are all dictatorships. And although they might not want to commit crimes against humanity on the scale of the Sudanese government or the proxies of the Sudanese government, they certainly don't want a world which starts applying democratic human rights standards to them. And if you look at the behaviour of the Arab League over Darfur, it is truly shocking. They are, even though they're fellow Muslims who've been killed, the fact they're black Muslims does matter.
So just in terms of that specific question, in terms of why it has been that both Muslim and Arab states, actually, I think, because Muslim states as well as Arab states have been very quiet, even those who are more democratic. I think one of the key issues is in fact the racism. I think that's one of the core issues, that black Muslims are not seen as being as Muslim as Arab Muslims or even as South Asian Muslims. And I think we've also had that problem in the UK. One of the things that I do is I coordinate a group of Muslim organisations on Darfur, and that's been a very, very hard piece of work to engage in and to pull off. And originally, partly because of Iraq, but for lots of other reasons as well. And I think Iraq was as much of an excuse as a reason. Those groups, many of the British Muslim groups, whether it's Muslim Council of Britain or many others, were quite standoffish in terms of engaging in Darfur. I think what we are seeing though is progress, at least in terms of the UK Muslim community. The Muslim Council of Britain, CrisisAction organised the Global Day for Darfur yesterday. The Muslim Council of Britain spoke at that. Dr. Dawud Abdullah, who's their Deputy General Secretary, and he spoke in very strong terms about what was happening in Darfur. He talked about it being genocide, he talked about the need for sanctions and pressure on the government of Sudan, and that from the Muslim Council of Britain. So I do think there is the beginning of a change, but that certainly hasn't. The Arab League is still in the position that it is, the Organisation of Islamic State is still in the position that it was. So getting that to begin to put pressure on others, I think we're still quite a long way away from. But with that said, when I was on my way here on the bus this morning, I was called by a colleague of mine out in Darfur, near the city of Kulbus, which is just north of El Janina. And as we speak at the moment, there's 1,000 troops who have just surrounded that city. They surrounded it yesterday night. 300 Janjaweed militia and 700 government troops. and it's likely that in the next 2 or 3 days, unless something does change and unless there is some pressure put on the government of Sudan to avert this, there will be a massacre in that city and thousands of civilians will be killed. It's something I'll probably take up with the Secretary of State afterwards. But that is here and now. That's happening this moment as we speak. Those troops are sat around this city, and they're saying that the city have to accept a new tribal leader, and unless they do so, they will go in and they will kill the civilians of that city. So that's why I think it's impediment that this continues to be a currency of discussion, and that what happened in Iraq and what's happened in other circumstances doesn't devalue the idea of humanitarian intervention. And I don't think it has in many ways. I think it obviously has in some quarters, but I was quite buoyed yesterday, for example, by the Day for Darfur, and I was one of the organisers, so I won't try and play it up too much, but the scale of that and the scale of the response to it was quite big in the UK. There were thousands of people outside Downing Street yesterday, but also just the coverage and the Sun, away from the page 3 girl, but the Sun on page 2, it's time to act on Darfur. They had an editorial, the Sun says today, the Independent front page today, the Metro front page. Really serious press coverage about what is a burning issue. Now, what we failed to do so far is to mobilise people around Darfur on this scale that we've managed to do so on Iraq. It simply hasn't happened. There was a mass mobilisation in Iraq, millions of people on the streets, as we all know. Where are those people now in Darfur? They're not on the streets. The vast majority of the people who do take part in the Darfur demonstrations are Darfuris. Now that's yesterday is a bit of a change actually. For the first time, there was a much broader coalition of people. But the previous 2 events that we'd organised had been very Darfuri led. Now that's shameful, really, to go out there and say, is it only Darfuris that care about the fact that 200,000 Muslims have been killed in Darfur? And the reality was pretty much yes. I think that has begun to change. I think people are beginning to wake up to it, but I think it's something that we need to do as civil society, also as the left, much better. I think we need to take it on. But I think, as I say, there is progress. And yesterday's demonstrations, it was partly organised by some big Jewish groups as well, the Union of Jewish Students, Rene Kassan, the Pears Foundation, but also, as I said earlier, the Muslim Council of Britain spoke at it for the first time and were involved in it for the first time. So that capacity, I think, and that potential is something that we need to exploit. We need to build on that momentum, and we need to re-legitimise the idea of humanitarian intervention, obviously in different forms. In terms of how we do that and how we take that forward, I do think that consistency is going to be critical. And I actually disagree with some of the, perhaps not the comments, but the background to some of the comments in terms of, I don't think Iraq was a humanitarian intervention. I think it could have been. I think it could have been sold as that. I think it could have been fought as that, and I don't think it was. And so I think if we pretend that Iraq was a classic humanitarian intervention, I think we do risk devaluing the idea of it. So I think we should be quite careful on that. Also, just in terms of, in order to make it work, and in order to be able to build a movement around it and to re-legitimise it and to build on it and internationalise it, I think we do need some consistency. I think the reason that there was I think a growth of humanitarian intervention and the ideas and the values behind it, and I think the idea is why it was doing so well, was because in Britain, at least in 1997, you had a new government. They came in, they addressed Sierra Leone, they addressed Kosovo in quite a consistent way, where the protection of civilians was central. I think that consistency has been more lacking in recent years, and I think the Lebanon case, unfortunately, is one where that consistency about prioritising the protection of civilians unfortunately wasn't applied, and I think it should have been, and we should have been criticising both sides for their attacks on civilians that happened during the crisis. So I do think it needs to be principle-based. I agree with Pat that doesn't mean you can have an action in every case, but I do think in order to build a movement around it, you do need to sell it as a principle, and in order to be able to sell it as a principle, you do need some consistency.